So in my last build, I went over a poison landslide druid build that was good for new players because it had no unique items and it was generally pretty easy to gear for. But in this video, I want to go over what's essentially an ultimate version of that build. This version is going to be using multiple uniques. We're going to have some change ups so we can get a lot more damage. And this version is almost going to be a bit more tailored around being able to do the pit efficiently so you're able to farm up tier 3 materials to completely masterwork all of your gear. And that brings us to our skill tree, starting with 1 point into Storm Strike. We don't actually care about generating Spirit in this build because we don't use Spirit, but we need Storm Strike for other effects. This will also just give you damage reduction at all times. Upgrade 1 can immobilize enemies. Upgrade 2 can make enemies vulnerable. Then we go down to 5 points in a landslide. This is our main damaging ability, but we don't actually have this on our bar. Our landslides are going to be procced from other effects. Upgrade 1 makes landslide immobilize enemies after it's hit enemies enough times. Then upgrade 2, when you immobilize or stun an enemy, you gain a terror emote. Each enemy hit by a landslide consumes that terror emote, making it a guaranteed strike, and it does more critical strike damage, and bosses just always have a chance to give you terror emotes when you hit them. Then we have Earthen Bulwark, which is just a barrier. Upgrade 1 makes us unstoppable, and we are going to be getting a bunch of resets that affect Earthen Bulwark, so we'll be able to have this up a lot of the time. Then we have Poison Creeper. Again, this is primarily to proc other effects. Upgrade 1 increases its immobilization duration. Upgrade 2 increases our critical strike chance against enemies affected by it. Then 1 point into Hurricane, again to proc additional effects. Upgrade 1 slows enemies. Upgrade 2 makes enemies deal less damage. Then we have 1 point into Trample. This is another ability that's going to proc our landslides, also makes us unstoppable. Upgrade 1 makes us deal more damage the less enemies it hits. This is primarily for against bosses because it can actually deal some decent damage. Then for our ultimate, we have Petrify. Stuns everything on your screen, makes them take increased critical strike damage against bosses. The duration is increased and they take even more critical strike damage. Upgrade 1 increases its duration. Upgrade 2 reduces its cooldown when you kill petrified enemies or when hitting a boss. And then we have our passives where we did change up a few points that will give us quite a bit more damage. Starting with Heart of the Wild to get 3 into Wild Impulses. Core skills cost more but deal more damage. We don't actually use Spirit for our core skills, so this is just more damage. Predatory Instinct for increased critical strike chance to close enemies, and we're always close. 3 into Ancestral Fortitude for increased resistances. 3 into Vigilance for DR when we use one of our defensive skills, and we're resetting Earthen Bulwark, so this will be up a lot of the time. Then we have 1 into Crushing Earth. Earth skills deal increased damage to CC'd enemies. 1 into Safeguard. Critical strikes with Earth skills fortify you for 3% of your max life. This is our main fortifying ability. Then at 3 into Stone Guard. While you have Fortify for over 50% of your max life, your Earth skills just deal more damage. Then 1 into Neurotoxin to get 3 into Envenom. You and your companions deal increased critical strike damage to poison enemies. Our Poison Creeper is going to keep everything poisoned. Then we're going down 3 into Defiance. Nature skills deal increased damage to elites. Natural Disaster, your Earth skills deal increased damage to vulnerable enemies. Storm skills deal more damage to CC'd enemies. And then Resonance, nature skills deal increased damage. You triple this bonus if you cast an Earth skill after a Storm skill or vice versa. And we're pretty much doing that majority of the time because that is also how we reset a lot of our skills. And the biggest change with our passives is we took out points higher in the tree and we put them into Quick Shift. When shapeshifting into a new animal form, you gain a 3% increased multiplicative damage for 8 seconds up to 18%. So this stacks 6 times for 18% multiplicative damage increase, which is very big. And the only way we currently proc this is actually using Trample, but because of how this build works, we're going to be resetting Trample all the time. And I did go test this on bosses. You should be able to keep this buff up on bosses, unless you have to run around and dodge stuff, which you may have to do. But even at that point, just getting like a 6% multiplicative damage increase is still very good. And then finally, for our capstone, we have Nature's Fury. Casting an Earth skill has a 30% chance to trigger a free Storm skill and vice versa. And this, mixed with one of our legendary aspects, is actually how we reset all of our skills. And then we have our Spirit Boons. Wariness to take reduced damage from elites. Iron Feather for more max life. Avian Wraith for increased critical strike damage. Pack Leader, which is a lucky hit. Critical strikes have a chance to reset your companion skills. This is very important to reset Poison Creeper. And then Combo for the Storm, another lucky hit. All nature magic has a chance to lower the cooldown of our ultimate. Petrify is very good. We want it up as much as possible. And then next up, we have our Paragon boards. And like always, there'll be a build planner in the description if you want to follow point by point primarily going over boards and glyph selection. Now, because of some of the changes in this build, specifically going with 2 different new uniques, I did change up some of the points in this build. Keep in mind, anytime you're making a Paragon board, make sure you're using it to also help yourself hit your armor cap and your resistance cap. Those are very important, and you can get a lot of them through your Paragon. So starting off, we have the exploit glyph, increase vulnerable damage. When an enemy is damaged by you, they become vulnerable for 3 seconds. This is very good because it just instantly makes all enemies vulnerable. Board 1 is heightened malice. While 3 more enemies are poisoned, you deal massively increased damage. And then the glyph we're taking is earth and sky, a bonus to magic nodes within range, and then nature skills deal increased damage to CC'd or vulnerable enemies. You get some damage to poison enemies, damage reduction from poison enemies, which is pretty good, and then some additional stat increases. Then we're taking the constricting tendrils board, and the glyph we're taking is outmatch. This buffs all rare nodes within range, and then you deal increased physical damage to non-elites and bosses. This will give us some max life, which is actually very good, some nature magic, and then some additional stats. And then we're going up, we're taking the inner beast board. The glyph we're taking is tectonic, increase earth critical strike damage, and then you gain a lucky hit. We have a lot of lucky hit procs, so this is going to be very good to just get more procs. Also on this board, make sure you're getting the magic and rare nodes to give you increased attack speed. Attack speed is actually pretty important for this build because of our basic skill, allowing us to reset other skills. Then we're taking Earthern Devastation. Your earth skills deal increased critical strike damage, and this is increased by the damage versus crowd controlled up to 40%, and that's all multiplicative damage, so it's very big. Mine's currently at 38. The thing you're gonna want to do to get this close to cap or at cap is have 2 pieces of gear with the tempering rolls of damage versus crowd controlled enemies on them. You should be able to get those pretty easily on piece of gear, so you can get this capped out. Then the glyph we're taking is Spirit, increased critical strike damage, then crits increase the damage an enemy takes from you up to 12%. Then finally we're taking the Ancestral Guidance board, and the glyph we're taking is Fang and Claw, another bonus to magic nodes within range. And then while in werebear or werewolf form, close enemies take more damage from you, and this will give us some core damage, some extra resistances if you need those, and then some additional stats. And that brings us to our gear. Now, starting out with gems, you're going to want critical strike damage in your weapons. You're going to want increased max life in your gear. And then on your jewelry, you're primarily going to want gems that are getting you to all of your resistance caps. I just have 3 diamond jewelry in them. That's probably going to be the best for this build because of how we go throughout our Paragon boards. We get a lot of all resist. So you usually don't need gems that give a bunch of resist into one. But either way, you want to try to tailor a Paragon board and your other pieces of this build so you're getting to your resistance cap with your gems in your jewelry. If you're really over cap, go and try to take out some points in your Paragon board that's giving resist all and put those into damage increases. And that brings us to our new uniques. Now starting off, I'm using Harlequin Crest. Now if you don't have this, as this is an uber unique, go ahead and use Godslayer Crown. Now Harlequin Crest is obviously much better as it's an uber, but Harlequin Crest gives you 20% DR at all times and +4 ranks to every skill. So this will buff our damage, our survivability, buffs basically everything across every ability in our build. So Harlequin Crest is super good, and you don't really lose anything from putting on Harlequin Crest, and you gain damage because you are losing a slot that could have a defensive legendary aspect. Now if you don't have Harlequin Crest, use a Godslayer Crown, and the special of this is when you stun, freeze, or immobilize an elite or damage a boss, it pulls in all enemies and you deal 60% multiplicative damage increase for 3 seconds. It can only happen once every 12 seconds. Now Godslayer Crown gives you those massive bursts of increased damage, which is very good. The downside of Godslayer Crown is you are losing a legendary aspect slot, and it doesn't give you any damage reduction like Harlequin Crest does. So you are going to be less tanky with Godslayer Crown, but in this version of the build, I would still use Godslayer Crown if I didn't have Harlequin Crest, because I want this build to be a bit more damage focused. It's a bit more endgame, so you're already super tanky as is. And all of the stats on the Godslayer Crown are actually pretty good for this build, and then Harlequin Crest does give that good cooldown and that very large max life increase. So both of these going to be really good. Harlequin Crest obviously going to be much better. Then we're also using Tybalt's Will. You gain up to 20% increased multiplicative damage while unstoppable and 5 seconds after. We have 2 unstoppables, Trample and Earthen Bulwark, that will reset because of our other effects. So we can have Tybalt's Will up basically 100% of the time, and that's just some big damage increases at all times. Now Harlequin Crest, obviously we're going to be losing another legendary aspect that makes us much more tanky. Harlequin Crest does come with damage reduction from close enemies, which is good, but you're going to be a bit less tanky using Tibalt's Will, but I think it's definitely worth it. Now, one of the main things we're losing with using these uniques is we are losing the aspect of Might, which gives us 20% damage reduction after using a basic skill for like 7 seconds, so that's just 20% DR at all times. But if you have Harlequin Crest, you get that back in its special, but if you're using Godslayer's Crown, you're basically just losing 20% DR all the time. And that brings us to our offensive aspects, the most important one being on our necklace. When the Nature of Fury key passive triggers a free skill, your non-ultimate cooldowns of the opposite are reduced by up to 7.5 seconds. This is our capstone we went over, where when we use a storm skill, it can give us a free earth skill and vice versa. Whenever that procs, the opposite skill type is reduced by 7.5 seconds, which is almost a full reset. So say we're spamming storm strikes, whenever that capstone procs, it'll reset the cooldown of Trample and Earthen Bulwark. When we use either of those, it can reset the cooldown of Hurricane. And again, this is why we want a lot of attack speed, so we can spam out our basic and get more Trample and Earthen Bulwark resets. Then for all of our other offensive aspects, Poison Creeper's active casts Landslide in a circle around it, and Earth skills deal more damage to poison enemies. So this is one of the ways where we cast landslides. We use Poison Creeper. It does 2 big circles of landslides, does massive damage. Then casting a Storm skill grants your Earth skills increase critical strike damage. Casting an Earth skill increases the critical strike chance of Storm skills. This will be up almost all the time. And then your core skills deal up to 30% increase in multiplicative damage based on your Fortify. This will be procced at max most of the time as well. Then Trample now summons 6 landslide pillars during its duration, and Trample is also now a nature magic and Earth skill. So Trample is the other way we cast landslides. We trample through a whole screen, it'll spawn 2 massive waves of landslides dealing massive damage. Then finally, landslides Earth pillars each strike a second time and deal more damage per enemy hit. So now anything that procs a landslide, it casts that landslide twice, which is again through our Poison Creeper and through our Trample. And then for our only defensive aspect, we're using Juggernaut, which gives you massive armor, but your evade has 100% increased cooldown. Now this is really important because this aspect itself caps out your armor. It literally gives you more armor than you need to cap your armor. So that's why it looks like we have way over cap, but that's just because this is how we're actually capping our armor. Now, because your evade has an increased cooldown, you want boots with the implicit that either gives you increased max evade charges or the one that reduces your evade cooldown when you hit enemies. Either one's going to be good. But that brings us to our boots, which when you have Fortify, your Earth skills gain +2 ranks. This is very good. We have a lot of Earth skills, and this will just be increasing our damage. Now, you could use a mobility aspect on this, but I like having the more damage from just having more ranks on our skills. And that's the entirety of this build. This build is easily still one of my favorite, even though it still has an issue on boss damage specifically. This build is actually crazy good for even higher tier pit runs because you're incredibly tanky. We have capped armor, capped resistances. I'm currently sitting here with no buffs at 52,000 health. I can get, I think it's like 75k health if we use the potion that increases your health and the incense that does it. Massive health. We have crazy damage reduction through Harlequin Crest, through getting DR from our Storm Strike, and through all of our other effects. This is probably the tankiest build I've played this season and easily one of the tankiest builds possible. So you have that down, and when you're facing lots of enemies, like you're going through a pit run before you get to the boss, anytime you crit on any of them, it can reset your Poison Creeper, so you're just getting constant Poison Creeper resets. You'll sometimes just be able to spam out like a dozen with no cooldown. So before you get to a boss fight, this build is crazy and can do super high pits, but once you get to the boss, you actually have a lot less damage. You're getting less resets on Poison Creeper, so bosses are the difficulty. But again, you're still super tanky. It's just that bosses are going to take a lot more time than maybe some of the other builds that are better against bosses. So an incredibly fun build, and I think this is probably the best version of this build you're going to get in Season 4. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.
I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready yet. I must wait a moment. I'm not ready yet. time to do that. I'm not ready yet. I must wait a moment. I must wait a moment. I need time to do that. I must wait a moment. I must wait a moment. I must wait a moment. I need time to do that. I must wait a moment. I need time to do that. I need time to do that. I must wait a moment. I must wait a moment. I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready yet. I must wait a moment. I must wait a moment.